see America, and it's from there that we have the real beginning of the feminist movement. All right, so we're going to talk about the first wave of feminism. The background has already been laid, that is since the days of the French Revolution, and later things that happened in England also with the publication of Mary Wollstonecraft's A Vindication of the Rights of Women. Then you had J.S. Mill and the other lady, what is her name? John Stuart Mill, and then you had Harriet Taylor Mill, and then you have other names like Marian Murray. All these people actually began, or you could say they were the pioneers who began this movement for reforms in society, because patriarchy was deeply entrenched in the psyche. So they had to face a lot of obstacles in their way. People were not open to their suggestions or their ideas, and many considered them to be way ahead of their times, because of which nothing much could be accomplished. Fine. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the first wave of feminism, which is situated in the United States. Now, why are we talking about the United States? We can see that the real movement, the first wave of feminism, had its origins in the anti slavery movement. It might interest you to know, and you might even wonder what is the connection between anti slavery movement, that is, the abolitionist, and the feminists. What is the connection, or how did feminism emerge out of the anti slavery movement? We're going to look at that. So, now it had its beginning in the anti-slavery activist. So what happened was there were these women activists, most of them white, yes, obviously white, because the blacks were under slavery. So these women, along with the men, they started participating in all these anti-slavery movements, conferences, conventions, strikes. They were white people themselves, but then they were against slavery. But when they went with men and when they went out into the public supporting this movement, the anti-slavery movement, they found out that they were being sidelined because of their gender. They were actually doing a service to society. They were trying to help the blacks out of slavery, and they were trying to give support to the men. But then what happened was when they got out of the public sphere, they started to be sidelined. They would be sometimes they would be allowed to all these conferences and gatherings, but then they would not be given an opportunity to speak up, speak out, express their views. Sometimes they would be humiliated by asked to leave the place. So if you look at your textbook on page 61, you have that in front of you, the first wave in the United States. So there is a small paragraph wherein you have this writer Joyce Cowley explaining how the Negro cause gave birth to feminism. So women who started out to plead for the slave, they found they were not allowed to plead. They were ridiculed when they appeared on speakers' platform. They were not accepted as delegates when they attended anti-slavery conventions. Within a short time, most of the women prominent in abolitionist circles spoke up for their own rights. So these women, they started realizing that they were also being sidelined. So they were fighting for the liberation of the blacks, but in the process, they realized that they were being insulted and treated just like the slaves by their fellow men. So that was a moment of reckoning, a moment of realization that they had to raise their voice for themselves. They also had the equal rights to stand along with the other white men and then speak about abolition of slavery. So that was the beginning. So there are certain names that we need to remember. One is Frances Wright, who was the first to speak up boldly against slavery. It's a woman, that's her name, Frances Wright. And then another very, very famous name is Lucretia Mott. Lucretia Mott, she was a Quaker minister. Quaker is one of the subsections of Protestant movements. Christian Protestant movement. So Lucretia, she was a Quaker minister and an abolitionist. So her ideas of human liberation, everything was deeply entrenched in her religious beliefs. So she founded the Women's Anti-Slavery Society. So she formed this for the women who were fighting for the rights of the black people. They had to go and establish a different committee society altogether. Why? Because they were not welcome in the groups and teams that consisted of all the male activists. So now, after she did this, that is the founding of the Women's Anti-Slavery Society, she was ridiculed, and the male members of the society, the clergy, remember, she was also part of the church. The clergy, they were really angry with her. They tried to harm her, and it was only because of a friend's help that she was saved from the fury of a mob. Otherwise, she would have been attacked and mauled by this angry group of people, I mean, comprising of men. So we can understand the kind of hostility that was faced by these women at the hands of the men. So it was a moment in history wherein women really understood the fissures. They really understood, though their intentions were good, they were not accepted at on par with the other men. So now, this lady, Lucretia Mott, she was invited for this American Anti-Slavery Society. So there was a movement. There was a movement, and she was chosen to represent America, and this happened in London. So she went there. But what happened was there were other delegates, other groups. See, these people all were from America. So there was this convention happening in London. So Lucretia Mott, she was her name was suggested, and she represented one particular group. So it could have been that Women's Anti-Slavery Society. So she represented that, and she went there. But then from America, there was also another group of delegates which consisted only of male members. Now, when these people they went to England, what happened was there was a lot of confusion. But somehow the organizers they allowed the women also to be a part of the convention. But then there was a kind of a, you could say, discrimination when it came to how women were allowed to participate in that particular program. So what happened to the women delegates, including Lucretia Mott? So they were women from England also. Please remember that. So these women they were asked to sit behind a screen and watch the proceedings of the convention. That is all the deliberations and discussions and deciding as to what to do next. So they were asked to sit behind the screen and then not to speak a word. So don't you think that was a insult, a kind of a humiliation, that you travel all the way from America in those days by ship or whatever, you travel to England you to attend this conference with so much of passion because you believe in that, but then there you are not allowed to speak, and you're made to sit behind some screen somewhere wherein you could just sit and watch the proceedings. So that was a terrible humiliation and insult for Lucretia Mott. But something good came out of this, and what was that? She got acquainted with Elizabeth Cady Stanton. She was one of the most radical of feminist leaders based out of England. So both of them got friendly. So this association would go a long way in the whole women's movement. So this is the good thing that came out of this particular visit, though she was humiliated there. And this led to the Seneca Falls Convention in New York, which marked the beginning of the women's crusade for rights in America. So this companionship, or you could say this collaboration between Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, both of them had organized that first Seneca Falls Convention in New York as a response and a reaction against the humiliation they had suffered at this anti-slavery convention held in London. That is this World Anti-Slavery Convention. And another person of note here is this lady called Angelina Grimke. She was a former slave owner who later became an abolitionist. So other women were also inspired to jump into the movement because she herself was a slave owner. But then she realized after some time that it is wrong and slavery was kind of a violation of human rights. And other pioneers of this, the first wave, are the names given here. Margaret Fuller. She had published this book called Women in the 19th Century, which turned out to be very popular. She was also a very popular journalist who was very good at networking and collaboration. She would go and speak at different meetings and conventions, especially societies of women committed to the ending of abuses of alcohol, and she was also an organizer of the Seneca Falls Convention. And many say that it is because of Margaret Fuller that the Seneca Falls Convention took place. And we have already come across the name Elizabeth Cady Stanton. She was also part of this Seneca Falls Convention. She was a radical feminist, and she wrote this book, The History of Woman Suffrage. And then you have another name, Susan B. Anthony, who founded the Temperance Society in America along with K.D. Stanton. She was also an abolitionist, and she founded the newspaper The Revolution, which was edited by Stanton. So you can find a lot of networking and collaboration between these women. They would write, they would edit, they would publish. That's the way they were going about doing their work. So they were actually laying the ground, the foundation for the whole movement. And all these networking collaboration, this led to this landmark event, which is known as the Seneca Falls Convention. This was held in New York in 1848. So the main organizers were Margaret Fuller and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. So what began as a Quakers meeting. So first they planned it like, to the outside world, they felt that this was just another women's religious meeting, something like a reformist movement or reformist meeting. It actually turned out to be the landmark, you could say the historical moment, wherein the group of women, they came together and they declared something. It's called the Declaration of Sentiments, wherein they read out to the world their demands, and it was like framed and made into something like a um, law. So just like what had happened during the French Revolution, if you remember the tennis court oath and all, right, by the people. Likewise, you have the Declaration of Sentiments by women during the Seneca Falls Convention. So this was a 2-day convention with lengthy discussions on the role of women in society and the rights they were entitled to. So they were trying to understand and analyze and find out what was wrong and what was needed, what were their rights. So it was kind of a self revelatory uh, moment in the history of women's emancipation. So this led to the Declaration of Sentiments, which included the right to vote for women. So they found that the men could vote, but women were not given the right to vote. So they said this should also be included in their charter. In their charter, uh, that demanded equal rights with that of women. So this can be seen as a fundamental document of the struggle for suffrage. Suffrage is the right to vote. So on page 64, you can see in that box the write-up, the Declaration of Sentiments. You can read that for yourself. So this says how there has been a lot of injustices against women, and how all of us are created equal, and then women, they are demanding, asking for their equal share and their right under the sun. So if you don't do that, you're denying one half of humanity all the niceties, rights and freedom and liberty that are extended to the male gender. So this is a like calling out of the patriarchal system. Now what happened was, as this movement progressed, till then all these women activists, they were united, they all were kind of closely connected with each other because they all believed in that, and most of them were abolitionists. And what started as an anti-slavery movement with women's involvement led to this feminist kind of a movement. But then somewhere along the way, what happened was the government, when they formed the policies, they gave Negroes as in black males, getting they were given franchisee. That is, they could vote. They were given the right to vote. And this event led to the split among the group of women feminists. Why? Because the women's demands were not included. Because among their demands, along with slavery, that abolition of slavery, everything, they had also demanded for um, the right to vote, which was not granted to them. So now, what happened was some of these women leaders, they were ready to delay and wait. They were ready to delay and wait for the women's enfranchisement in favor of the Negro men getting it first. So they said it's okay, let the Negro men have it first, and then slowly we can fight for the women's rights also. But this was not acceptable to the other group of women. And why? Because they felt really betrayed. They said, like, we women as a group, the whole sisterhood, we fought for everyone. And now look at what has happened. When the time has come to form policies and pass laws, it was done in favor of men, and it was supported by a group of women also, wherein they were okay with being excluded and not being given the right to vote in the first instance. So this was not acceptable to the other lot. So they felt very betrayed at this exclusion of women. So now there was this formal split when they had the next convention, American Equal Rights Association convention. So this led to a formal split, and two groups were formed. So one group was headed by the moderates as in they were ready to wait. So this group consisted of leaders like Lucy Stone, Julia Ward Howe, and all these women who really believed in the abolition of slavery. For them, that was more important than fighting for women's right to vote at that moment. It's not that they did not want it, but then they were willing to wait. They were ready to wait, and they were okay with being sidelined in the initial stage. So they were these moderates under women like Lucy Stone and Julia Ward Howe. And they formed the American Woman Suffrage Association called OSA. Please remember these names. Whereas the other group of women, they did not want to wait. So they felt really bad. They felt betrayed. And this group, they turned out to be really radical. So they were a little violent in their protests, and they were unhappy with the whole situation. So you have there Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan Anthony, and all these people. So they were the radicals, as in very outspoken, impatient, and they wanted their rights to be given without any delay. So, and what did they do? They formed another association, and they called it the National Women Suffrage Association. So this consisted of women who were radical in their outlook compared to um, the moderates who formed the American Women Suffrage Association. So now, if we have to conclude about the first wave of feminism, we need to remember that more or less it was a moderate movement. It was only towards the end that there was a break, and then you have a small radical group coming up. So their main focus was suffrage, that is, fighting for the rights to vote. That was their main idea or the main focus. And they prefer to use political clout, that is, political support, rather than undertaking rebellious campaigns. But these things would come later. The kind of rebellion, the kind of radical kind of a movement, that would come later. You can see the beginnings here among the same of the first wave under Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan Anthony. But then it was only a, you could say, a subset or a small line of activism. But then more or less, if you have to speak about the first wave, it is remembered as being very moderate. Whereas when you're talking about National Women Suffrage Association, that is the radical group, they looked at broader goals than just the achievement of suffrage. So for them, the fight meant not only the right to vote, but then many other things. So they were more, you could say, inclusive. They wanted to look at broader goals. Whereas AWSA, that is American Women Suffrage Association, they were moderate. They believed in lobbying and petitioning, and for them, the main focus was suffrage. Whereas NWSA, the national group, they were more militant. They resorted to things like hunger strikes and picketing compared to the methodology used by OSA, which was very moderate, like lobbying and petitioning. So this particular wave, they were not really concerned about other issues like abortion or a right over one's own body, marital rape, all these kind of things. They were mainly focusing on the right to vote. So though you have people like Susan Anthony who had voiced her support in favor of owning one's body in a married relationship. So she openly spoke up against things like marital rape and how women are subjected even physically in a marriage. So she was against all that. But then there were not much activism and movements regarding those ideas, though it was prevalent during that particular time. So that's how we conclude the first wave of feminism. So the first wave, we talk about America, mainly American women, though we have the inclusion of Lucretia Mott and all from England, and their main idea or the main focus was on suffrage or the right to vote. And then towards the end of this movement, the group split into two. Why? Because Negro men, they ended up getting the right to vote. They did not have the right. But these women, the abolitionists and all of them, they favored anti-slavery. But then when only men were given the rights to vote, it actually led to a split in the women's activism. So one group, they were willing to wait it out, and they supported the Negro men getting the right to vote at the cost of the women being excluded. So they were okay about it. Whereas the other group, the radical group, they were very angry, they felt betrayed, and they did not want to wait anymore. So they went ahead and they formed this National Women's Suffrage Association, which was more radical in their ways. So you can call them a militant form of feminism, which resorted to hunger strikes and picketing, compared to the moderate ways of the other group, which formed the American Women's Suffrage Association, which was more moderate and made use of methods like political lobbying and petitioning. Then this is very important, this particular wave, and the landmark here was the Seneca Falls Convention, which led to the Declaration of Sentiments, wherein these women um, spelled out and spoke out what are the things that they wanted. And one main thing was suffrage, that is the right to vote.